On a frozen Tuesday morning in February, Giselle Harmon signed a contract with a smirk she did not bother to hide. $1,000. That was the number she assigned to a crumbling garage she openly called a pile of junk not worth the cost of clearing. The man standing across from her wore a scuffed work jacket and carried grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. He did not argue. He did not flinch. He simply took the key, nodded once, and walked away into the gray winter air. Giselle turned to her assistant and said something that made the whole group laugh. 6 months later, the name Caleb Merritt appeared on the front page of a regional business publication, and Giselle Harmon, the woman who signed that contract, stood outside a building that used to belong to her company, staring at a reality she had manufactured herself and could not undo. Listen closely, because what happened inside that garage changes everything you think you know about how value works, where it hides, and what it costs a person who is too certain too quickly to look past what is in front of them. Caleb Merritt grew up in a house that smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee. His father, Raymond Merritt, opened a one-bay garage on the outskirts of Detroit in 1987 and ran it for 22 years until his back gave out and his hands could no longer hold a wrench steady. Caleb spent every Saturday of his childhood in that garage, not playing, not watching television, but learning how to listen to an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, learning how to read the stress marks in a frame the way an engineer reads a blueprint, learning how to see past rust and cracked paint and dead batteries to the mechanical soul underneath. By the time he was 17, he could diagnose an engine fault by sound alone. By 19, he was rebuilding transmissions from scratch. By 22, he had earned an engineering degree in automotive systems from a state university, graduating near the top of his class, and landed a position at Vantage Auto Holdings, a mid-size firm known for its technical restoration division, the kind of work that required both academic precision and hands-on instinct. Caleb had both in abundance. He spent 7 years at Vantage. He was not the loudest voice in any room, but he was often the most accurate one. Colleagues trusted his assessments. Managers relied on his reports. He built a reputation as the man you called when something seemed impossible to save. But institutions do not always reward the people they rely on most. 8 months before the story truly begins, Vantage Auto Holdings finalized a corporate merger. The acquiring company had no interest in the technical restoration division. It did not fit the new financial model, did not generate fast enough returns, did not look good on a restructuring slide. 14 people lost their jobs that Friday night, their notifications delivered by email at 11:17 in the evening. Caleb read his on his phone, sitting at the kitchen table of a rented apartment that barely held his tools and a bed. He did not reply. He closed the screen, sat in the dark for a while, and then went to sleep. The next morning he started making a list. He spent 8 months doing what he had to do, patching vehicles at a local impound yard, living on a tight budget, saving whatever he could after rent and groceries. He did not waste energy on bitterness or noise. He looked for opportunity, the way his father had taught him to look at broken engines, methodically, quietly, without the expectation that it would announce itself. He was 31 years old, he had no debt beyond a small credit balance, and he had $18,000 in savings, not enough to open a shop, but enough to start something if the right start appeared. Giselle Harmon had never fixed anything with her hands in her life, and she would have told you that with no apology. She had a different kind of intelligence, financial, territorial, relentless. At 38, she ran Harmon Capital Group, a real estate firm she had inherited from her father at 29 and grown aggressively over the following decade. Revenue had more than doubled. The company had moved from residential flips into commercial development, then into urban industrial redevelopment, buying old manufacturing land cheap, rezoning it, and selling it to developers at a significant premium. It was a business built on recognizing land value before others did, which made the irony of what was about to happen particularly sharp. Giselle had a reputation for being direct to the point of cruelty, for cutting meetings short the moment she decided the agenda no longer served her, and for treating anything she did not immediately understand as something beneath her time. She had been called a visionary by her local chamber of commerce, and a bulldozer by the people who negotiated against her. Both descriptions contained the truth. She was not cruel in the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel. She was indifferent, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways harder to argue with. Indifference does not bend to evidence the way that malice sometimes does. It simply does not register the evidence in the first place. In January of that year, Harmon Capital acquired a 4-acre parcel of old industrial land on the northeastern edge of the city, a former light manufacturing zone that had been sitting dormant for over a decade. The plan was straightforward: hold the land, push through a rezoning application for mixed commercial use, and flip the whole parcel to a larger development group within 2 years. On paper, the acquisition was clean. In practice, it came with a complication. Sitting at the rear corner of the property was a garage structure, roughly 900 square feet, built sometime in the 1960s, with a rusted corrugated tin roof, 3 collapsed interior shelving systems, a main roll-up door that had not opened in 3 years, and an electrical system that a Harmon technician described in one word: dead. Giselle's team estimated the demolition and clearance cost at somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000. That was money Giselle had no interest in spending on a building she considered a liability. When the idea of selling the structure consider brief internal conversation, she approved it in less time than it takes to pour a cup of coffee. List it. Get rid of it. Move on. Owen Parker heard about the garage from a truck driver who hauled scrap from the area. Owen had worked alongside Caleb Advantage for 3 years, and the two men had remained close after the layoffs. Owen was now freelancing welding, fabrication, occasional engine work, and he called Caleb the evening he heard the rumor, more out of instinct than certainty. He told Caleb what he knew. Old garage, bad condition, Harmon Capital wanted it gone, might sell cheap. Caleb said very little on the phone. The next morning, he drove out to the property and parked on the far side of the street. The temperature was hovering near 20 degrees. Light snow moved sideways in the wind. He sat in the car and looked at the building for approximately 15 minutes without moving. From the outside it was, objectively, not impressive. The roll-up door was visibly warped. 2 of the 4 small windows on the side wall were boarded over. The roof had a visible sag at the eastern corner, but Caleb was not looking at what was visible. He was calculating the dimensions, noting the concrete foundation, observing the way the structure sat on the lot, and most importantly, registering the address. He knew this intersection. He had driven through it dozens of times. He knew what was around it, what was adjacent to it, and he had a quiet but precise suspicion about what was coming to this part of the city within the next 12 to 18 months. He called the number on the sign staked at the gate. He got a Harmon Capital assistant. He asked to arrange a viewing. The appointment was set for the following week. Giselle arrived with 3 people: her assistant Adrian Cole, a structural engineer from a contracted firm, and a real estate attorney. She wore a caramel-colored wool coat, heeled boots, and carried the particular expression of someone who has already decided the meeting is a formality. Caleb arrived alone. He wore his standard work jacket, carried a small spiral notebook, and showed up 2 minutes early. When Giselle's car pulled in, she stepped out, looked around the property briefly, then looked at Caleb with the kind of assessment that takes about 3 seconds and draws conclusions from the wrong data. She asked him, in a tone that made her assistant smile, whether he was a mechanic or a scrap hauler. Caleb did not answer the question directly. He asked if he could see the inside. Giselle unlocked the side entrance. The roll-up was impossible and gestured for him to go ahead, then followed with her group. She narrated the defects almost immediately, the way a real estate agent narrates features, but in reverse. The roll-up door had been jammed for 3 years. There were 3 visible structural cracks in the ceiling joists. The electrical was fully non-functional. A site assessment had identified possible foundation settling in the northwest quadrant. She said her team valued the property, accounting for demolition costs, at negative $15,000. She said this clearly and without softening, as if making sure Caleb understood that he was not being offered a bargain, he was being offered a problem with a price tag attached to it, to make the problem go away faster. Caleb nodded slowly and walked into the interior. It was dark. He used the flashlight on his phone. He moved methodically from wall to wall, corner to corner, running his hand along the concrete block walls, looking up at the ceiling, crouching down to check the floor surface. He spent 12 minutes inside. Then he came back out into the cold and asked one question: "How much?" Giselle looked at him for a beat, then turned to Adrian and repeated the question in a voice pitched for the group, as though the question itself was the punchline to something. $1,000, she said, with a full waiver of any harm and liability, and a relocation clause, requiring Caleb to vacate the structure within 18 months should the broader redevelopment project receive formal approval and break ground. Caleb agreed without negotiating. He signed the contract at a folding table that someone had set up near the gate, with the wind cutting across the lot and the attorney watching over his shoulder. When the handshake was done, and Caleb had the key in his jacket pocket, Giselle said to Adrian, just loud enough, that she was noting in the file the sale of a derelict garage to a very optimistic man. There was quiet laughter. The group walked back to their vehicles. Caleb stood at the gate for a moment, then turned back toward the building and walked the length of the exterior one more time before heading to his car. He stopped near the side door for exactly 2 seconds, looked through the gap in the warped frame at something in the far interior corner, something beneath a large blue tarp, something that rose from the floor nearly to the ceiling, and then he walked to his car and drove away. He came back the next morning at 6. He came with a heavy flashlight, a pry bar, a set of hand tools, and his spiral notebook. He did not start with the structure. He started with the tarps. There were 8 of them, in varying sizes, layered and tied with rope and coated with years of dust and the residue of a building that had been sealed and forgotten. He pulled the first one back slowly. The way you open something you are fairly certain is valuable, but cannot afford to be wrong about. Underneath was a car. He pulled the second tarp. Another car. He worked through all 8 in just under 30 minutes, each one a variation of the same revelation. 8 automobiles, arranged in 2 rough rows, every one of them covered and left in a building that Harmon Capital's team had walked into, looked around, and classified as an empty demolition target, without ever once looking past the tarps that covered the most significant contents of the space. He stood in the middle of those 8 cars with his flashlight moving slowly from one to the next and said nothing out loud. The first car he cleared enough dust from to read the badge, a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback. The body had surface rust on the quarters and roof. The paint was peeling in wide strips, but the chrome trim was all present. The glass was intact, and when he opened the driver's door and looked at the odometer, the reading confirmed the car had not moved in decades. He checked the VIN plate. Original stampings. He opened the hood. A Vate block. Fully present. No visible catastrophic damage. Cylinder head covers intact. He wrote 4 numbers in his notebook and closed the hood gently. The second car took his breath away slightly more than the first. A 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28, a production variant so limited in number that collectors had been known to pay serious money for examples in far worse condition than this one. The frame number was readable. The Rally Sport trim was intact. He wrote that number down and drew a small circle around it. Cars 3 through 5 were sedans from the 1950s and early 1960s, a 58 Chevrolet Bel Air, a 61 Ford Galaxy, and a 63 Buick Riviera, all recoverable, all worth money after proper restoration, though not at the level of the first 2. The 6th car stopped him completely. He had to crouch down and look at the badge from a particular angle to make sure he was reading it correctly. A 1971 De Tomaso Pantera. An Italian-American sports car produced in limited numbers through a partnership between the Italian coach builder and Ford's engine division, with total production across all years numbering only around 10,000 units. Finding one in any condition was unusual. Finding one in a forgotten garage in the Northeast, with its chassis present and its mid-engine compartment sealed but intact, was the kind of thing that happens in stories, except this was not a story yet. It was still just a cold building with a flashlight beam moving through it, and a man in a work jacket writing numbers in a notebook with a hand that was not entirely steady. The last 2 cars were too far gone. Floor pans collapsed, body panels corroded through, but they held usable components, and components had value too. He wrote everything down, his rough estimate. Sitting on an overturned milk crate in that garage with the notebook open on his knee was somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 in restored market value if the work was done correctly. He had paid $1,000 for the building and everything inside it. He walked the surrounding blocks in the afternoon. He knew this area in the way that people who grew up nearby know a neighborhood not from maps, but from repeated presence. The garage sat at a corner lot where two secondary roads intersected, approximately a quarter mile from an on-ramp to a federal highway, and directly adjacent to a bus corridor that the City Transit Authority had been quietly planning to expand for the past 18 months. 3 vacant lots sat immediately behind the garage, facing the secondary road, and they were listed for sale at prices that reflected their current appearance. Abandoned, unlandscaped, surrounded by chain link. Nobody had connected those lots to the infrastructure map yet. Caleb had an acquaintance from his engineering years, a man named Marcus who now worked in municipal planning, and he called him that evening. He asked a simple, neutral question about the development zone classifications for that quadrant. Marcus gave him a simple, neutral answer. The entire block sat inside what the city's internal planning documents called a Phase 2 Commercial Development Priority Zone, meaning that within 12 to 18 months, the infrastructure upgrades would be formally announced and land values in the zone would shift accordingly. Caleb thanked him, ended the call, sat at his kitchen table, looked at the numbers in his notebook, and smiled. It was the first time he had smiled without reservation since the night he was laid off. He called Owen the next morning. He did not explain everything on the phone. He said only that he had found something, that there was no salary in the immediate term, and that he believed it would be worth the investment of time. Owen asked how much Caleb had paid for the property. Caleb said $1,000. There was a pause. Owen asked him to repeat the number. Caleb did. Another pause, and then Owen said he would be there by 8. When Owen walked into the garage and saw the 8 cars partially uncovered, he stood in place for a long moment. He looked at the Camaro, then the Mustang, then the Pantera. He turned to Caleb and said, quietly, that he had to sit down. Caleb told him they would start with the Mustang. Owen took off his jacket and asked where the tools were. The first 2 months were the kind of work that does not photograph well and does not make for easy storytelling. It was relentless, repetitive, cold, and occasionally demoralizing. Caleb slept in the garage during the first 3 weeks to save the rent money, laying a cot near the south wall where the wind did not cut through. They worked from before sunrise to well past dark most days. The Mustang required a crankshaft replacement, a part that had to be sourced through a private supplier in Ohio, and the 3-week wait meant they shifted to preparation work on the Camaro and the Bel Air, pulling apart, cleaning, cataloging, assessing what could be rebuilt and what had to be replaced. Caleb spent his own money carefully. $18,000 had seemed like a workable foundation, but between replacement parts, specialty fluids, body shop compounds, new wiring harnesses, and the welding rod and sheet metal stock that Owen went through at a steady pace, the account moved in one direction. By the end of the first month, he had $1,200 left. He did not tell Owen. He took 2 nights of towing work through a contact at the impound yard to generate enough cash to order the next batch of supplies, and said nothing about it. One night in the middle of February, a section of the eastern roof failed in a rainstorm, not catastrophically, but enough that water poured directly into the open engine bay of the Camaro, which they had fully disassembled for inspection. Owen put his fist on the workbench and said several things that are not worth repeating. Caleb stood looking at the water pooling in the cylinder cavities, then found 2 additional tarps and covered everything that was exposed. He cleaned up the water with rags. He went back to what he had been doing. Owen watched him for a minute and then picked up his tools and went back to work too. There was a period, around the 3rd week of February, when Caleb sat alone in the garage late at night and took out a small notebook, not the spiral one with the vehicle records, but an older one, water-stained at the corner, that had belonged to his father. Raymond Merritt had written notes in it across 30 years of working on cars, observations, measurements, reminders, small pieces of philosophy that had accumulated the way grease accumulates in the threads of an old bolt. On one page near the middle, in his father's blunt handwriting, was the sentence, "When they see rust, you see the metal underneath. Caleb had read that sentence perhaps 100 times in his life. As a child, it had sounded like a mechanic's proverb. As an adult who had spent 7 years at a corporate firm, it sounded like the most economically accurate thing anyone had ever written down. Caleb took out a pen and wrote below it, in his own hand. $1,000, February. This is where it starts. He closed the notebook and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, where it stayed for the remainder of the project. By the end of March, the Mustang was finished. Not repainted in candy colors or modified with aftermarket parts restored, correctly, to its original specification, the way a serious collector demands. The body panels had been stripped, primed, and respray painted in the factory-correct shade of Highland green. The chrome had been re-chromed where necessary and preserved where possible. The V8 had been rebuilt with period-correct components. The carburetor rebuilt, the cooling system flushed and resealed, the interior retrimmed in correct black vinyl. When Owen rolled it out of the garage on a Saturday morning with the sun just clearing the rooftops, he sat behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine caught on the second crank and settled into an idle that was deep and even and entirely authoritative. Caleb stood at the edge of the open roll-up they had repaired the door by the end of January, with his arms folded, and listened to the idle for a full minute. Owen revved it once, gently, and the exhaust note moved through the air in a way that communicated something that could not be expressed in numbers. Caleb said only that it was good and went back inside. He posted a single listing on a private forum used by serious collectors of American muscle cars. No auction platform, no open marketplace, just a carefully worded description, accurate vehicle history, photographs of the restoration work, and a contact number. He received 11 inquiries in 72 hours. The one he prioritized came from a woman named Diana Ashford. She was 55 years old, a widow who had inherited a significant estate from her late husband, a man who had made his fortune in industrial manufacturing and who had spent the past decade building one of the more serious private collections of American classic automobiles in the northeastern region, housed in a climate-controlled facility on her Vermont property. She did not negotiate aggressively. She asked precise questions about the VIN, about the original build sheet, about the specific suppliers used for the chrome restoration, about the engine rebuild documentation. Caleb answered each one with the same level of precision she brought to asking them. She arranged to inspect the vehicle in person and arrived with her own mechanical engineer, a retired Chrysler employee named George, who wore a flat cap and said very little but spent 2 hours underneath the car and around the engine bay with a borescope and a reference notebook. George told Diana in a low voice that the restoration was, in his assessment, about as correct as he had seen outside a professional museum restoration. Diana shook Caleb's hand and offered $94,000. Caleb accepted. The wire transfer cleared 3 days later. Owen saw the notification on Caleb's phone screen and grabbed him by the shoulder. Caleb allowed it for about 2 seconds before stepping back, nodding once, and walking to the workbench to pick up where he had left off on the Camaro. Diana said something before she left the lot that lodged itself in the architecture of what followed. She told Caleb, as she was putting on her driving gloves beside her car, that she had friends in her circle of collectors who were actively looking for quality restoration work. She said if he came across anything worthy, he should call her before posting anything publicly. He told her he appreciated that, and meant it. What he did not tell her was that he had 6 more vehicles in the building behind her, at least 2 of which she would likely want herself. Within 2 weeks of the Mustang sale, Diana had passed Caleb's contact information to 2 people in her network. Both reached out. Within the month, he had sold the 1958 Bel Air, restored to a high standard, in its factory-correct Snowcrest white over India, ivory two-tone for $28,500. Between those 2 sales, he had cleared $122,500 in revenue against an original outlay of $19,000 in purchase price and restoration materials. He moved on the land immediately. He contacted the owners of the 2 vacant lots directly behind the garage, not through a broker, not through a formal listing, and purchased both through a straightforward private transaction totaling $67,000. The owners, neither of whom had current knowledge of the phase 2 zoning development, were content with the price. Caleb filed the deeds, began the business registration paperwork, and took a third lot on a purchase option that would convert in 60 days. He hired 2 additional technicians, a body specialist named Kevin, who had previously worked for a restoration house in Pennsylvania, and a part sourcing expert named Ray, who had spent 15 years tracking down rare components through private networks. Owen became, by function, if not yet by formal title, the technical director of the operation. The business registered under the name Merit Restoration and Auto Works. The De Tomaso Pantera consumed 6 weeks and tested every skill the team collectively possessed. The engine, a Ford Cleveland Vate mounted amidships in the Italian body, had been seized from inactivity, and freeing it without damaging the block required a chemical process that took 11 days and an amount of patience that Owen described as almost religious. Sourcing the correct body components meant importing specific panel fabrications from an Italian specialist who worked from a small shop outside Bologna and communicated primarily through a fax machine. The interior required sourcing correct specification, vinyl and carpet from 2 separate suppliers, one in Germany and one in New Jersey. The wheels needed to be rebuilt from the center out. The electrics were, in Owen's professional opinion, a deliberate attempt by the original Italian engineers to make future maintenance as challenging as possible. But when it was finished, when the car sat in the garage under full lighting, its deep red paint restored to a depth that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its wedge profile, as aggressive and controlled as it had been when it left the factory in 1971, it was, without question, the finest single object that any of them had ever had a hand in producing. Charlotte Webb had been covering business and finance for the Northeast Business Review for 9 years, and she had a specific talent for finding stories that the financial press had not yet classified as stories. She heard about Merit Restoration through a contact who attended collector car events in the region, called Caleb in early June, and was told, politely, that he was not interested in being interviewed. She sent him an email the following day. She did not offer a favorable profile or promise positive coverage. She wrote that she was not interested in documenting success. She was interested in the moment someone saw something that everyone else had dismissed and decided to act on what they saw. Caleb read the email twice, thought about it for a day, and agreed to 30 minutes. They met in the garage, which was by that point a functioning, organized, staffed operation that bore no resemblance to the building he had unlocked in February. They talked for 2.5 hours. Charlotte asked about the cars. She asked about the tarps. She asked about the February morning and the key and the contract. She asked who had sold it to him. Caleb said without heat or emphasis that the property had been sold by Harmon Capital Group and that the CEO had signed the paperwork personally. Charlotte wrote this down and underlined it. The Barrett-Jackson Special Consignment event was held on the last Saturday of June at a conference facility in the city. Caleb had submitted the Pantera for consideration in January, before the restoration was complete, on the strength of the vehicle's provenance and his documentation of the restoration plan. It was accepted as one of 10 featured lots for the evening session. Caleb arrived in a dark suit, the first time he had worn one since his father's funeral 5 years earlier. Owen sat in the second row with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression he used when he was trying not to show that he was nervous. Diana Ashford was in attendance. She had heard about the consignment through her network and came with 2 companions from her collector circle. She and Caleb made eye contact across the reception hall, and she raised her chin slightly in acknowledgement. The Pantera was the 8th vehicle presented. When it came through the curtain onto the main floor under the overhead lights, there was an audible shift in the room, not applause yet, just the collective intake of breath that happens when something genuinely beautiful enters a space. The auctioneer introduced the vehicle, its history, its rarity, and its restoration provenance. And when he named Caleb Merritt and Merritt Restoration and Auto Works as the restoring firm, a section of the audience who had read Charlotte's article, which had been published 4 days earlier, responded with a round of applause that was warmer than the typical lot acknowledgement. The bidding opened at $80,000. It moved quickly to $100,000, then $130,000, then paused at $155,000 before a phone bidder pushed it to $168,000. A man in the third row came back at $172,000. The phone bidder responded. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the number is real and the participants understand it. The hammer came down at $178,000. Owen exhaled so loudly that the man next to him turned around. Caleb sat still for a moment after the gavel fell, then stood and accepted the handshake from the floor representative. He was composed in the way that only people who have spent months in a cold garage working toward a specific outcome can be composed when that outcome arrives. Not surprised, not overwhelmed, just confirmed. Giselle Harmon was at the event. She had not come for the auction itself. She had come because her attorney had told her, after the article ran, that she should understand the full scope of what had happened before deciding how to respond to it. She stood near the rear of the hall during the bidding, watching. She watched the number climb. She watched the gavel fall. She watched Caleb accept the congratulations of the people around him with quiet economy. After the session concluded and the room began to thin, she walked across the hall toward him. It was a walk that required something from her, not remorse exactly, because Giselle Harmon was not built for remorse, but something adjacent to it, something that required her to override the part of herself that had been running a specific, self-protective narrative since the morning Adrian had placed the article on her desk. Charlotte Webb saw her moving across the room and already had her notebook out. Giselle stopped in front of Caleb. She was without her team. There was no Adrian, no attorney, no engineer. Just her, in a different coat than the one she had worn in February, standing in front of a man whose name was now in 2 business publications, and who had just watched his work sell for more than $178,000 in a single evening. She said that she had misjudged the situation. She did not elaborate. She did not offer additional language. From another person in different circumstances, the statement might have seemed insufficient. But from Giselle Harmon, who had built a professional identity on the premise that her assessments were more accurate than everyone else's, the admission was, in its way, complete. Caleb looked at her for a moment. He did not use the opportunity to revisit February. He did not quote her words back to her. He did not perform the vindication that the situation technically offered him. He said, in a level voice, that she had seen what the building looked like and made a call based on what was visible, and that he had made a different call based on what he believed was underneath. He said that they had looked at the same thing with different equipment. Then he extended his hand. She shook it. He turned and walked back to where Owen was standing and said something to him quietly, and they both looked at the empty floor where the Pantera had been displayed, and then they started talking about the Camaro. By the end of June, the complete financial picture of Merit Restoration and Auto Works looked like this. Total revenue from vehicle sales in the Barrett-Jackson consignment had reached $398,000. The 3 lots of land acquired behind and adjacent to the original garage had, following the formal public announcement of the Phase 2 infrastructure program in May, been independently assessed at a combined value of $520,000, approximately 3 times what Caleb had paid for them. Active restoration contracts, including a commission from Diana Ashford for a vehicle she had sourced independently and wanted Caleb's team to bring back, along with 2 additional contracts from clients in her network, totaled $145,000 in confirmed work. The total net asset value of the operation, accounting for equipment, property, outstanding contracts, and the 2 remaining restorable vehicles still in process, was estimated to exceed $1 million. Owen Parker had been offered a formal 20% equity position in the company, which he accepted without the need for a long conversation. Caleb submitted a building permit application for a permanent structure on the consolidated lot, a proper multi-bay facility with a dedicated paint booth, a climate-controlled storage bay, and an office wing. He named the project on the application documents Merit Auto Works, Building 1. He went back to the garage alone on a Thursday evening in early July, after the crew had left for the day, not to work just to stand in it. The roof had been fully replaced in April. The concrete floor had been cleaned, patched, and sealed. The roll-up door operated on a new motor. The electrical system was entirely new. The space was organized, lit, functional, and for the first time since its construction, genuinely alive. He walked to the eastern corner, the one where he had pressed his hand against the wall, on the morning of his first day inside. the morning of the tarps, and the flashlight, and the notebook. The wall there had not been repainted. The original concrete block, spotted with rust stains from the old roof and darkened with age, was still exactly as it had been when he first touched it. He had told Kevin, when they were going through the renovation, to leave that section. Kevin had asked why. Caleb had said only that it was the most important part of the building and that it should stay as it was. He stood in front of it for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in the place where it had started. Then he turned off the bay lights, locked the roll-up door, and walked to his truck. People who heard the story later, and many people heard it, because Charlotte Webb wrote a second piece that ran in 3 national publications, often asked Caleb what the lesson was. He gave different answers in different moments, depending on who was asking and what they seemed to need to hear. To other tradespeople, he said that credentials do not protect you, and neither does institutional loyalty. So build the thing you can build with your own hands. To younger people, he said that being dismissed is not the same as being wrong. To journalists, he said very little, because he had learned from his conversation with Charlotte that the more he said, the more other people's interpretation filled in the spaces he left open, and he preferred the story to mean what it actually meant rather than what was convenient for a headline. The shortest answer he ever gave, and the one that appeared in the most print, was still the same. Look more carefully before you decide. In private, in the notebook that lived in his jacket pocket, he wrote something longer, on the page below his father's handwriting and below his own entry from February. He wrote that Giselle had seen the cost of things and called it value, and that he had tried to see the value of things and let the cost figure itself out. He wrote that she had looked at rust and seen a problem, and that he had looked at rust and tried to understand what the metal underneath was capable of. He wrote that neither of them had been irrational, they had just been trained to look for different things. And in that one transaction, on that one cold morning, the difference between those 2 ways of seeing had been worth approximately $1,000 on one side of the ledger and everything else on the other side. He closed the notebook. Outside the window of his new office, a small room he had set up in the corner of the garage, with a used desk and a proper chair, the lights of Merritt Auto Works were still on. Owen had left a compressor running in the back bay, and through the wall, Caleb could hear the slow, regular pulse of it, the sound of a shop that was working, that was alive, that had been built from a decision made in the cold, with a key in a jacket pocket, and a number written in a notebook, and a very specific way of looking at things that other people had already decided were not worth looking at. The De Tomaso Pantera, that sold for $178,000, had spent 40 years under a blue tarp in a building assessed at -$15,000. The garage that housed it had been sold for $1,000 by a woman who was certain she understood value. Caleb Merritt had paid $1,000 for it because he was certain he understood something else entirely, and in the end, the thing he understood was not the cars, and not the land, and not the contracts and the auction and the article and the handshake. It was the difference between what something looks like and what it is. That difference, measured in time and certainty and 6 months of work that started before sunrise and ended past midnight, turned out to be worth considerably more than $1,000. It turned out to be worth everything.